But we're now going to start, so I'd ask for a bit of quiet. Curious, if anyone wants to talk, plenty of room out the back, no problem. But we're going to start off the night. It won't be that long, but I know you're waiting to hear from Mick. A couple of other speakers first. My name is Padraig Yeates. I helped Mick edit the book. I've just got a few thank yous to say at the beginning. I'd like to thank Mercier Press for agreeing to publish it, and Mary Phelan, the commissioning editor, who recognised the intrinsic value of the book, and also that it was a story well told. I'd like to thank as well Douglas Mulholland, and I'd like to also thank, if he's here, or family are here anyway, I'd like to thank Seamus Brogan. I don't know if Seamus is here or not, but they played a very essential role, because this book was written over 30 years ago, and it wasn't publishable in that form, and they need their work converting it into a modern Word format for it to be even brought near a publisher. So that was absolutely vital. I'd like to thank Brian Hanley, who gave running commentary on the contents and made many comments, and you'll hear from Brian yourself afterwards. And I'd like to thank all the people who've come here tonight, many of them Mick's old comrades, to get the book and to see him again and to meet each other again, in many cases after several decades. And everybody is very welcome. I know there are people here who've had differences with each other over the years. I'm one of them. But I want to say everybody is welcome, whether you're young, whether you're old, wherever you went or wherever you've come back from. Everybody here is very welcome, and I'm glad you could all make it tonight. This is the only book by a participant in the campaign from the very beginning to the bitter end, who saw through that campaign, and it's his story. And it's a very simple, unadorned story. It's a very honest one. In places, it's a painfully honest story, I think. And I think it distinguishes it from a lot of the other stuff that's been written on the Troubles, from sort of hysterical condemnations on the one hand to what is little more than hagiography on the other end of the scale. But this is a very honest book. Mick is simply telling it as it was and as he saw it. He's not trying to explain it to people, he's not trying to justify it, neither is he obviously condemning it. So I hope people will read the book and draw something from it. I just also want to take the opportunity, while I'm up here, before introducing Hughie, of just thanking Mick for the privilege of knowing him and working with him, and in fact working for him for a number of years in the old UI office. I can't always say it was a pleasure, but it was certainly entertaining and occasionally even enjoyable, and I hope you all enjoy yourselves tonight. So I'm going to kick off proceedings by asking Hugh Jordan, who Mick asked especially here to sing tonight, to sing one of Mick's favourites, to kick off proceedings, The West's Awake. Thank you.
Thank you. Just in case you don't know, this instrument I'm going to play here is a ukulele. Some people were asking me earlier, but that's what it is. It looks very small, but it has a big enough sound. Yeah, Mick asked me to sing a couple of songs here. I'm delighted to do so. And both these songs, I'm going to do one at the beginning and one at the end, but both these songs I actually learned from the singing of Mick many years ago, longer than I care to remember. But I was just saying to him before I come up here, it's nice to see so many people in Liberty Hall, and there seems to be more Zimmer frames and walking sticks than rifles tonight, and that's probably a good thing. When all beside our vigil keep, the West's asleep, the West's asleep, lass and well may Erin weep, when Connaught lies in slumber deep. Their lake and plain smile fair and free, mid rocks their guardian chivalry. Sing, oh, let man learn liberty from the crashing winds and the lashing sea. We're often in O'Connor's van, to triumph dashed each Connaught clan, and fleet as deer those Normans ran, through Kirchleaf's Pass and Ardrahan, and later times saw deeds as brave, and glory guards Clan Rickard's grave, sing, oh, they died their lands to save, at Aughrim slopes and Shannon's wave. When all beside a vigil keep, the west's asleep, the west's asleep, the lass and well may Erin weep, that Connaught lies in slumber deep. But hark a voice like thunder spake, the west's awake, the west's awake, sing, oh, hurrah, let England quake, we'll watch till death for Erin's sake.
Thanks, Hughie. I'd ask Moinda Burka if she come forward now, just say a few words. Another old comrade.
I won't keep you too long. Mick and I go back to not to 1956, but about 58, 59, 60. I was 18 when the border campaign broke out. I was working and living in Bray, County Wicklow, and some of the lads would find their way to Bray who were on the run, because for some reason at that time Bray was a kind of a free area for members of the IRA. I don't know if that's Mick's memory of it, but the Garda Commissioner at the time was a man called Quinn, and he lived in Bray. And I think at the beginning the lads would be kind of, you'd be keeping them quiet and keeping them in the background. But in the end, it was that they could walk the streets of Bray quite freely. And I don't believe any of them were ever arrested in Bray, even though it was quite well known who they were. But anyway, I had a bed sit, and every now and again one of them would come in, and I'd go off to work, and they'd stay and have a few hours sleep, or a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, and that was how I met Mick in the end. He was one of the lads on the run who needed a bed, and that's how it worked out. Then there was kind of a gap when the campaign was over. There was a bit of a gap, and then the movement was moving to the left very distinctly. And Mick was happily one of those who embraced that move and all the activities, if you like, that came with it. And my abiding memory of Mick is kind of a personal one, if you like, and at least 2 or 3 occasions when we were trying to stop an eviction, some of the flats around the centre of the city, and the sheriff would be there and the guards would be there, and you'd be sort of feeling a little bit outnumbered, and somebody would make a call back to the head office, and I felt like the guys in the Western films who kind of outnumbered by the Indians, and around the corner would come the sheriff and his posse, and everybody would cheer in the cinema. But Mick would arrive with 2 or 3 of the lads, and the whole scene changed. The bailiff would take himself off. In quite a lot of the cases, the guards would take themselves off. We'd put the family back into the house and all would be well. But I distinctly remember Mick arriving with his posse on a couple of occasions, and the sheer relief of it was unbelievable. I'm happy that he has written this book. We all have our own ideas about the campaign, but we took part in it in one way or another. It's part of our history, it's part of the history of our country, and it must and should be written down. And I am now hoping to goodness that he is halfway through volume 2. Thank you.
Thanks, Maureen. I'd say there's a few more people in the room now waiting for volume 2, but they'll be waiting quite a while, I assure you, because there'll be a lot of work still to be done on it. But the final speaker before Mick himself is Brian Hanley, who many of you will know, will have met, because he interviewed so many people when he and Scott Miller, who unfortunately can't be here tonight, wrote their book, The Lost Revolution. So we've asked Brian as someone who's detached but not unsympathetic, or to come here and say a few words about the book and about Mick, and then we'll have Mick himself say a few words. So Brian, if you come forward.
Thank you. Good evening. I was very pleased to be asked to speak at this event. I first became aware of Mick Ryan, I suppose, a lot later than most of the people in the room. I first really became aware of Mick when I read a short article that he'd written about the 1960s in a special edition of the United Irishman that was published in 1998 for the centenary of the 1798 rebellion. And that article was fascinating because while I knew something about the history of the IRA, I had rarely read a detailed description of the movement during the 1960s by someone who'd been prominent in what became the official Republican side. And rereading Bower Bell's Secret Army, I came across other references to Mick, but he seemed to disappear at some point in the narrative, and at the time I didn't know enough about the subject to ascertain what had actually happened to him. I'd never heard him mentioned in any public coverage of the Workers' Party, for example, in the 1980s or 1990s. Then in 2004, when Scott Miller and I started researching what became the Lost Revolution, Ger O'Leary gave us a number of names of potential interviewees, one of whom was Mick. And we first met Mick in August 2004. And while he was courteous, he was also clearly cautious and wary of our project. He mentioned that others had contacted him for similar interviews and that he wasn't always very happy with the results of these. So over the next few years, we had intermittent contact with Mick. And eventually, he agreed to speak to us and then generously welcomed us into his home and helped us out in various ways. At one stage, he gave a talk on the border campaign to students of mine in Trinity College, for example. Along the way, he occasionally mentioned that he'd written a memoir and that he might show it to us at some point. And that memoir is the basis for the book that is being launched tonight. And I think, as Padraig Yeates has mentioned, it's important to stress that this book wasn't written in the last few years. It was composed somewhat closer to the events that it describes. It's not a book about the official IRA or about the events of the 1960s or 70s, but about Mick's journey from childhood in East Wall to involvement in the IRA and the subsequent border campaign. And it was written mainly in America. In the early 1980s, Mick emigrated to the United States. He lived for a period in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and he completed a history degree at Marquette University while he was there. He then moved to New York and he worked for several years, I think, as a copy editor in a legal firm. And the core of this book was written in his evenings after work, when he reflected from memory about how he became involved in Republican politics, and I think, and I hope I'm not making assumptions here, about how he felt how much of what he believed in had ultimately been betrayed. What emerged from those evenings of writing in New York was a vivid account of growing up in Dublin, specifically in East Wall during the 1940s and early 1950s. This was a world of rationing, of selling firewood door to door to make ends meet, of school in St. Lawrence O'Toole's, of exploitative working conditions as a teenager, of a growing awareness of injustice and a sense that his generation might play a part in ending partition and uniting Ireland for once and for all. There are many aspects of the book that will no doubt be familiar to others of Mick's generation, but younger readers might find harder to identify with. Indeed, it's almost impossible to imagine a modern teenager showing the same astounding deference towards the clergy, for example, or the fear of being caught out in confession and the guilt of what Mick as a youngster perceived as sin. It's a very evocative account of a Dublin that in many ways no longer exists. Mick brings the same skill to his account of the day-to-day experience of the border campaign. Though he would be on the IRA leadership at the conclusion of that campaign, the book is mostly the view of a foot soldier, of somebody following orders rather than issuing them, training in the Sally Gap, moving up to a farmhouse in Atboy, County Meath on the eve of the campaign, excited but also worried about what was to come, of hiding out in caves in North Antrim, attempting to carry out ambushes with inadequate weaponry, the cold and hunger of life in border dugouts, the frustration of testing faulty bazookas in Wicklow over Christmas 1958 or 1959, the hopes that were placed in how this weapon might actually change the course of the campaign, the disappointment when they realised that it wouldn't, the growing awareness that their effort might fail, and grappling then with being regarded as an IRA leader by the early 1960s. The generosity and willingness, he describes, of numerous Republican supporters and others, sometimes of even those hostile to the campaign, who welcomed these people into their homes. The hospitality, again, very often of those with very meagre resources is described, as I say, very, very vividly. There are descriptions of bringing news of the ceasefire to supporters in Ballinamore, County Leitrim, and being welcomed, and also of the anger and bitterness of others who felt let down by the ending of the campaign in 1962. Mick allowed me to read a draft of this book after The Lost Revolution was published. He waited to see what we'd written before letting me see what he'd written. And it immediately struck me as an outstanding memoir. He himself was less confident and was very worried, and I think has been worried up till recently, if it was good enough to be published. And I think in many ways, is testament to the great untapped potential among thousands of young working class children of Mick's era who left school early. This is really a work, a fine work of literature and a fine memoir, and Mick should be very, very proud of it. We have to be thankful to Padraig Yeates, who was able to secure a publisher and also carry out the onerous task of acceding to the demands of the publisher that a manuscript of perhaps 200,000 words or something like that be reduced to what they believe is a publishable 60,000. I wouldn't be giving away any secrets if I said that writers and publishers have a very antagonistic relationship, and they believe less is more. Writers don't always think that. And that means, of course, there's a few details that I liked that were lost. Mick's father as a young boy was one of the many civilians wounded during Easter 1916. In the original text, I think the location of where he was wounded was mentioned. I think it was the Annesley Bridge. And the name of his companion, Walter Scott, who was actually killed, was also included in that text as well. Similarly, Mick's description of his journey to a Jewish-owned army surplus shop in Cable Street to buy his combat fatigues didn't make the final cut. And as a historian, it's actually much of that social detail that I liked, again, of a Dublin that in many ways has vanished. Again, when Mick describes his employment at Palgrave Murphy's, his employers were all ex-officers in the British Army, ex-unionists in the Dublin of the 1950s. Again, a scene that, as I say, has changed very much. But this, of course, is a book primarily about the IRA. The belief that Britain could be forced from Ireland by armed struggle was not illogical in 1956. Indeed, we cannot understand the background to the campaign unless we understand Southern Irish society at the time. It's forgotten now that on Easter Sunday 1949, the biggest crowd seen in Dublin since the Eucharistic Congress gathered to acclaim the declaration of the Republic, when the 26 counties left the British Commonwealth under the inter-party government. Hundreds of thousands of people packed O'Connell Street. There were bonfires on the Dublin mountains, a 21-gun artillery salute at the Customs House. Thousands attended similar events in Cork and elsewhere. And while the Evening Herald applauded the achievement of what it called a nation once again, it still lamented that it was a matter of profound regret that the establishment of the Republic is marred by the temporary absence of the 6 counties. President Sean T. O'Kelly, himself of course a 1916 veteran, would remind citizens that there could be no going back and no rest, no cause for self-congratulation until the Republic of Ireland reigned unchallenged from Rathlin to Cape Clear, and there could be no true peace until the unity of Ireland under the Republic has been accomplished. Their clothes temporarily stolen, Fianna Fáil and De Valera embarked on a global anti-partition campaign. The Fine Gael-led government sponsored their own such effort, many of the denunciations of British misrule being written by a young civil servant named Conor Cruz O'Brien. Privately, a minister in the same government and a relatively recent chief of staff of the IRA, Sean MacBride, was prepared to trade NATO membership for an end to partition. Outside the corridors of power, a grassroots and more radical anti-partition campaign emerged, from which a number of activists would eventually progress to the IRA. So this was a society in which all the main parties claimed to want a united Ireland, in which most of the political and civil service elite were still veterans of the struggle for independence, and in which the education system emphasised patriotism and Ireland's long history of resistance to British rule. The popular press regularly harked back to the 4 glorious years, and the late 40s had seen the publication of Tom Barry's best-selling memoir and the various county fighting stories. It was, of course, a romantic and partial view of the struggle for independence, but it's not surprising that it inspired many to ask what would be wrong with completing this struggle. All Mick and his comrades were guilty of was taking the rhetoric seriously. Their model, of course, was to be the War of Independence, or more precisely what the popular memory of that war was, hence the wearing of uniforms, adherence to the Geneva Convention, and so on. Like many Republicans, they had an intense devotion to particular aspects of their history, while ignoring or simply not knowing about contradictory aspects of it. That the core of the Belfast IRA in 1922 supported the treaty, and that many of its members joined the Free State Army would have surprised those who assumed the loss of the North had been the key factor in the treaty split. That the IRA of the late 1920s had far deeper organisational and political links to Soviet Russia than anything that was dreamed of in later decades, and that it wasn't in the least controversial in the late 1920s, would certainly have shocked the outwardly at least pious and anti-communist 1950s IRA. The initial agreement between the IRA and the Soviet Union had in fact been drawn up under Frank Aiken, who would be a minister in the Fianna Fáil government, which interned Mick Ryan. The vision many people had of the 1916 leaders and those who followed them was of self-sacrifice and nobility. And Mick writes of his disappointment when some of his comrades seemed to fail to live up to these ideals. The reality was, of course, that the revolutionaries of 1916 to 23 were just as capable of suspicion, jealousy, pettiness and incompetence as anyone else, and many of them did not like each other much at all. Kathleen Clark, for instance, could suggest that Padraig Yeates knew about as much as commanding a garrison as her pet dog. But such an admittedly harsh opinion would have seemed impossible to a generation of Republicans who thought of the 1916 leaders as essentially secular saints. But it would be wrong to judge the men and women of the 1950s on the basis of what we now know about the independence struggle. The IRA had a partial view of Irish history, but so did most people, and for long after the 1950s. There was a further factor in Mick's radicalisation. The stark class division of Irish society, both urban and rural, 30 years after independence, is evident in his narrative. The failure of the new state to provide for a large section of its people was brutally obvious. I remember Mick becoming very emotional talking about seeing the young people on board the boats leaving Dublin for Liverpool in the early 1950s. That was an era of mass emigration, when 40,000 people left this state every year, and in which there was little of the angst about a so-called brain drain that accompanied the last recession. It was, of course, because most of those leaving in the 1950s were poor. And while some politicians fretted publicly, a senior economist at UCD was perhaps more honest when he argued in 1955 that a high rate of immigration is not necessarily a sign of national decline, and policy should not be over-anxiously framed to reduce it. High immigration, granted a population excess, releases the social tensions which could otherwise explode, and makes possible a stability of manners and customs which would otherwise be the subject of radical change. In other words, let them leave. They might cause trouble if they stay. As Mick says, many IRA members believed that their effort would bring about a fairer Ireland, and that a united Ireland would deliver prosperity, even if they weren't sure of the mechanics of how this would happen. There appears to have been little discussion of the history of their own movement's politics, though the IRA had embraced radical social policies just 2 decades before, but there seems little sense of that among the 1950s generation. Nevertheless, these men and women were driven by a belief that something was wrong and that they wanted to change it, and they should not be condemned or worse, patronised for believing that. After the campaign ended, there was no consensus about what would happen next, and it was possible to draw very different conclusions from the experience of the previous 6 years. However, the activists of the 1950s resemble the IRA of earlier generations in another tragic sense. Some of those who had soldiered together between 1956 and 62 would by the 1970s kill each other. There is no way of avoiding this subject and the impact personally and politically of the splits and divisions which have emerged since. But this book should primarily be read as the personal story of one young Dublin Republican, Mick Ryan, who saw there was injustice and who tried to do something about it. Thank you.
Thanks for putting such a good and even profound context on events, Brian. and it's a reminder for all the members of the congregation to remember just how grim things were back in the 60s and 70s. So now the main event, what you've all been waiting for, I'm going to ask Mick to say a few words about the book or about himself, and I'd ask you to a warm welcome.
Tá fáilte róg go léir, ben Seán Ucht, agus an buíochtaí bet an seo chun an píosa atá á rád an ar beige rád an faoi na blianta a bhí mé má bhail den IRA. I would like to thank you all for coming this evening to share this occasion with me and others in the room who had a similar experience. Some people may wonder how I managed to remember when they read this and read the book so much of this after so long, but I actually wrote this account of the border campaign as part of a longer memoir in the 1980s after I had ceased to work full-time in the Republican movement, without, of course, losing my belief in or commitment to the Republican ideal and the aspiration of us to a secular, pluralist, democratic and just society. I wrote that memoir in large part to explain to myself why I had spent my entire adult life up to then as an active member of the movement, and when that commitment meant to me and my comrades, but particularly to ensure that the legacy was not entirely bad or lost. The border campaign, as it was called, and probably rightly so because it was mainly conducted along the border, is probably the least known phase in the long struggle for the Republic that is the most likely to be forgotten. It remains largely neglected by historians, even now that more attention is being given to the 1950s and 1960s. Unlike other aspects of Irish life, such as the economy, party politics, literature and the arts, it will remain neglected unless those of us who participated tell our story, no matter how hurtful that might be to people's memory. But the truth is very important here, and I have endeavoured, like in this book, to tell it as it was. And some people thought I was being too harsh about that situation, but I'm glad I did. And anyway, unlike other aspects of Irish life, such as the economy, party politics, literature and the arts, it will remain neglected unless those of us who participated tell our story. I believe the so-called border campaign was important also for many other reasons, not least for helping sustain the Republican tradition after the movement that gave it expression had about collapsed in the preceding years. We remember people like Tomás McCurtain of Cork, and more recently our late comrades like Tomás McGilla, Frank McCarty of North Antrim, Cathal Goulding, Sean Cronin, Malachy McGurran, Leo Stinson, to mention but a few. We of course also want to remember our friends and supporters who passed away, who shared our inspiration for a better Ireland. Several of them played a critical role in the new direction that the movement took after the campaign, as some of us looked back and conducted what was in effect a post-mortem on the campaign, and the legacy left by the traditional primacy of military activity that had been a hallmark of the Republican movement since the 1920s. How well we succeeded is a matter for others to judge, but as most people know, we were forced into a ceasefire in February of 1962, and it was just necessary. We got an awful lot of hostile activity from those in the IRA who felt that this was a betrayal, but it wasn't a betrayal. It was a recognition of the situation we were in. We were probably disarmed to an extent that the IRA never had experienced before. But I want to continue. To some extent, we were victims of our own success. When the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association campaign took off, no one had anticipated the degree of support and success, or indeed problems it would pose. We were neither organisationally, politically, or militarily ready to meet the challenge. And looking back, it seems a miracle that we had evolved as far as we had in little or more than 5 years. The problem was that the world around us had evolved even faster in many ways, but was still mired in the past of others, particularly in the north. This book ends before that new phase in the struggle began. It looks back in the 1940s and 1950s, my growing up in Dublin's East Wall, and being inducted, like thousands of other youngsters, into the mysteries of life, both joyful and sorrowful, starting work and developing an interest in Ireland's historic spirit for freedom. I not only identified fully with the leaders of the 1916 Rising, as many did, and those who fought in the War of Independence, but I wanted to be part of the continuing struggle for that aim, an Irish Republic that treated all of its citizens equally. This book attempts to tell that story. I have been as honest as I could, and as was necessary, and as accurate as memory allows, and hope that people who read it will accept that declaration, whatever they think of my actions. I also hope that it will give people a better understanding of what happened, why it happened, and accept the integrity of our motives. We were young, idealistic, and committed to the armed struggle as the only possible way to achieve our aims. But we attempted to keep that struggle on a military level, and the injury or damage to civilians was kept to an absolute minimum. There was never an intention to injure civilians of that. And I'd just like to conclude with this, because the time is running out for the organisers. I would like to conclude by thanking Brian Hanley for travelling from Scotland and bringing us the historical academic perspective on the campaign. Maureen de Burke for being a staunch supporter and analyst of the Republican movement over the years. Hughie for adding to this event by his music to lighten the atmosphere here this evening. Padraig for his sterling work on editing this book, and without whom the book might never have seen the light of day. And a big thank you to my wife, Anjo, who has stood by me through thick and thin over the years, and has given me very valuable advice to balance my views. And the last thing I'd say is thanks to Mercier Press for taking on the publication and distribution of the book. And of course, thanks to all of you who have come along this evening to support me and celebrate what is for me a watershed moment in time. And I just say thank you very much to everyone, and I take this opportunity to thank everyone outside of the room here who ever helped us along the road, no matter how they felt, and they gave us shelter. And I'll leave it at that, and thanks very much for your attention.
I'm going to ask, sorry, before I say that, just to assure anyone here who has a copy of the book, and my apologies if we had to start, but if we hadn't started when we did, we'd still be waiting to sign the book. But anyone who has a copy of the book here, Mick will sign it before you leave, just to reassure you of that. And now to finish off, I remember back in the 60s when things were very desperate and when it didn't look like anything much was going to happen, except people would eventually get their free travel pass from Charlie Hockey. There would be a late night session, and Mick's party piece was Leave Them On. So I'm going to ask Huey Jordan, would he now sing that for us? And with that, we'll conclude and say, hope you enjoy the evening, and anyone who wants the book signed, that'll be done.
Thank you, Padraig. Yes, as Padraig touched on there, music was a part of Mick's life, and the Irish, an appreciation of the Irish ballad tradition was very much evidence in the house that Mick grew up in East Wall. I was lucky enough to have been there a few times and met Mick's mother. And one of the absolute delights of my life was when I went to her funeral, and I was in the church, and I actually hadn't seen Mick, but then I heard this voice sing Sean O'Riordan's Creasna Shield, and I knew instantly it was Mick, and it was a stunning piece of music, and that thought remains with me for the rest of my life. So I'm going to sing the song that I learned from the singing of Mick. Probably the oldest Irish song I know. My heart is broken, and in sorrow a token of regret for years now spoken by the English lords. They knew we could do no harm, and they knew we possessed no arms but pikes and spears, and but a handful of rusted swords. We had no major, no hero leader, no man to order us. We drifted on like cows to a drover. The fair, it is over, and we are scattered on the sunny shoulders of Slievenamon. But the French are waiting, and their masts they are straining, and the people they are saying that they sail the seas. Their ships are in serried lines, and their order is grand and fine, as they race against the wind to settled Ireland free. And if I knew this tale was true, like a blackbird I would sing for you a happy song, to see broken ranks swaying, and hear French trumpets ringing, as freedom they come bringing to sleep no more. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the evening and stay and meet over. Thank you.